As a kid, I was drawn into animal protection through popular media and sort of Ranger Rick. I was always interested in wild animal protection. And then in graduate school, as I sort of, became practical and started thinking about a career, I read a paper by Daniel Pauly, who had become my PhD supervisor, called Fishing Down Marine Food Webs, which was in Science in 1998. And it took fish catch in the Northeast Atlantic and what's called the mean trophic level, or the position of the fish caught on the food web, looked at it over time and showed that large predators were disappearing from the catch and that the catch was being dominated by species lower on the food web. And so that paper was in 98. In 2001, Jeremy Jackson and company published another paper about global overfishing that relied on historical records and archaeology and what's called paleoecology. And all of this anecdotal work and historical work that didn't rely on modern fish catches, but looked really deep into the historical record. So through a totally different set of data, coming to similar response and analysis showing that overfishing was occurring globally. And then in 2003, a paper by Myers and Worm showing that, again, since sort of 1950 to the present, based on global catch data, that large predators in the ocean had disappeared by about 90%. That industrial fishing had wiped out all of the big animals in the ocean. And these three papers, I would argue, I teach them as a triumvirate of papers that really shifted, I would say, the entire scientific community into a mindset of global overfishing. And for me, that issue had been largely ignored by the animal protection community, and I went to work on fisheries for my PhD because I still consider it the largest direct threat to wild animals globally. Science shaped my own research agenda and approach to animal protection profoundly after I went to NYU, and a lot of people were working on food, animals, and the environment. And as I understood through that research how big of a polluter industrial animal ag is on the environment, I began to think that these polluters were not just involved with shaping the physical processes of our planet, but were likely involved with shaping our political discourse and public understanding of the science. And I began to pull on that thread, and it's shaped my entire research agenda moving forward. So I'm looking at the US meat industry's early understanding of climate change and how it responded to it. And just like the oil and gas companies, these companies are heavily involved with preventing any forms of regulation and in sort of polluting our information landscape so that the American public is confused or fails to understand the role of animal ag in climate change.
In my career, I've been super excited and surprised to realize that some of the features of gregarious, charismatic animals like chimpanzees and dolphins, things like social learning, social structures, and culture are found really broadly across animal species. And the most surprising discovery that I read was that fruit flies socially learn from one another. So for example, a fruit fly female who watches another fruit fly female mate with a male, when she has a choice between a male with a pink dot on his back or a green dot on his back, the observer will later select the same color male as the demonstrator selected, and that this behavior spreads through the entire community. So if the first observer saw the female mate with a green dotted male, everybody's mating with green dotted males. And this lasts not just for one generation, but this behavior lasts for 9 generations. So offspring are learning it from their parents. And it's only after about 9 generations that the behavior starts to degrade. So this looks like something that is quite a cultural behavior in an animal that many people don't even acknowledge as an animal. These fruit flies who come into my kitchen every July and live in my sink and on my fruit, I think about them very differently now. I don't need to go and look at chimpanzees in Africa. I can look at the fruit flies in my sink. And so that has been a really exciting transition for me, and seeing animal persons all over, even in my own kitchen.
I am a baby boomer, and so my life really did parallel the growth of National Geographic, of Jane Goodall, of all of those television shows and specials that we saw in which we learned about the natural world, in a way that my parents' generation didn't have the same kind of knowledge of the natural world. They had knowledge of the natural world, but in a much more utilitarian and instrumental way. But in terms of faraway places and exotic animals, they didn't have the kinds of experiences that my generation was able to have. And there's this famous image, for example, of Jane Goodall touching the hand of David Greybeard, which is the first time that it's been documented in which a human and chimpanzee actually touched each other. And that was, for me and for many people like me, every bit as inspirational as that image of the Earth from space was for other people later.
You know, science sort of tells us that we can't go it alone, right? As animal advocates or as lawyers, you know, we really need all kinds of different people, all kinds of different expertise if we're going to bring about change in this field. And it's very important that we be able to speak to each other, to understand and learn from each other if we're going to be able to build these kinds of compelling cases and to move the needle as far as improving the lives of animals. So I think that's really critical. I think the other thing that I'm always reminded of is, you know, it's science that kind of tells us that we as humans are animals in the first place. You know, that's not how we used to think of ourselves. And I think it's sort of an important point to kind of come back to working in this field, that, you know, we're not apart from animals, we are animals. Animals are us. And so I think, you know, science really reaffirms those connections in profound ways that many of us working in this field feel.
Some of the things that come to mind are science has really invited me to question my definition of animal. One of the most interesting books I read this year was by Merlin Sheldrake, and it was about the fungal layer of life that is under the ground that we don't see, we don't interact with, or we do really, but we don't think we do, and that is really alive, sentient in many ways, and profoundly important to our existence. And just having that world opened up to me, like they're not animals, but they're living beings. So I think it makes me, that broadens my sense of what animal advocacy is, because it's more than just dogs and cats and cows and pigs. And there's really interesting stuff on plants and plant sentience that I think will further challenge our categories. And so I'm engaged with science every day. It's like the first thing that I'll read in the newspaper are the science articles. So although I sound like I'm sort of cynical about science, I also love science, and I think it's the key to curiosity and collaboration and care between humans and other beings.
When I first started doing this 20 years ago, I was a graduate student and learned that there was a monkey lab on my campus, and was horrified just by the fact animals were being tortured with our tax dollars in this university laboratory. But what science was able to do was help me build a case against this laboratory and ultimately shut it down. So I was able to use science to show how much these animals were suffering, to show that it was bad research that wasn't helping anybody, and that there were better methods available. So scientific research was the foundation for this grassroots advocacy and policy campaign that we led and successfully shut down this laboratory. And without that base of scientific knowledge to show how much animals were suffering and how bad animal experimentation is scientifically, we might not have been able to save those animals. So even though I'm in this for moral and ethical reasons, because I think it's wrong to torture animals in laboratories, I think science is giving us the tools to make the changes we want to see and save animals.
One of the things that I've been just very moved and influenced by is the science that's coming out around aquatic animals and fishes in particular. There had historically, just not been a whole lot of work on fishes and what their lives are like, their social lives, their personalities, their preferences, their choices. And in the absence of that work, human beings don't spend a lot of time underwater. We don't have sort of an intuitive sense of what fish are like. And so there was no scientific evidence. We don't have daily lived experience around fishes. And there was basically a big blank in terms of the lives of fishes. And then that blank turned into a notion that the fish themselves were blank, that there was just nothing to see here, there wasn't anything going on there. They're basically like machines that just sort of, move through the water. But as the science has sort of filled in more information about what their lives are like, what the decisions are that they make, what the nature of their social relationships are, what their life trajectories are like, their personalities, and even culture now that they have intergenerational knowledge inheritance, it has filled out that picture from being a blank into a fully fledged, rich world that now we can understand that even though we haven't researched every single species, there's 30,000 different species of fishes, there's enough of a proof of concept that these lives are full of meaning and history and surprise for us when we actually engage with the taking seriously looking at their lives and putting in the time and dedication to understand them.
I've been extremely surprised by a lot of the recent evidence concerning insects. Even a few years ago, I was reasonably skeptical about the idea that insects might be sentient beings with feelings, emotions, lives of their own that matter. But it does seem like the evidence is pointing that way, particularly the evidence from bees. Extraordinary studies showing that bees are not just wonderful learners, but they also seem to display play behaviors, that they will not only roll balls into holes to get sugar reward, but they'll also roll the balls if there's no reward, as if doing it for fun. And then this sometimes leads people to the view that bees are special, that they are unique among insects. And I've come to doubt that as well. What we're starting to realize is that these traits are probably not unique to bees, but are there in much smaller insects as well, like fruit flies, for example. And there's been some rather remarkable studies showing what look like play behaviors in fruit flies, where they will choose to ride around on a little carousel to get the experience of the motion. And studies too showing that Drosophila, which is a tiny fruit fly very widely used in science and traditionally viewed as non-social, not only is a kind of social animal, but also when experiencing social isolation will have its sleep disrupted, and as though experiencing stress from being socially isolated. So results like these are absolutely transforming the way we think about insects and raising huge ethical questions about how we should be treating them.
I'm a climate scientist, and so I started my career looking at the impacts of climate change on food security and agricultural production. And I worked mostly across South Asia and Africa, and I still do. And during that time, those projects are still going on, but this is starting about 11 to 12 years ago now. During that time, I was fully subscribed to the idea that animal agriculture was critical to global food security. That was the narrative or the assumptions that we had made as climate scientists. And so a lot of the work was oriented around the risks of climate change to animal agriculture from the viewpoint that animals were needed in the food system. So then when I started my current job at New York University, it was then that two really formative studies came out that changed my mind. And so the first was Livestock's Long Shadow, a report that was in part published by the UN Food and Agriculture Organization that illustrated, or rather, it was a scientific report that quantified the role that animal agriculture plays in climate change. And so here I was looking at the impacts of climate change on animal agriculture, thinking it was critical, and not realizing or not really being exposed to the fact that animal agriculture was significantly contributing to the problem, mostly in terms of very powerful greenhouse gases like methane and nitrous oxide, which we hear a lot about carbon dioxide, but those gases are even more powerful in many ways. So that was the first eye-opener, and I remember being really surprised and even sort of emotionally dismayed by that project or by that study. And there have been subsequent studies, obviously, that have come out now. I was dismayed because the science that I thought I was doing, which was supposed to help society, actually came with this really big caveat, and it was really problematic, right? The kinds of assumptions we were making in the climate community. So that was surprising and game-changing for me in terms of my own career. And then shortly thereafter, another big set of scientific studies came out under this new scientific framework called planetary health. And these were studies that really, for the first time in a really coordinated way, linked the environmental impacts with the health impacts of our food system. So these sets of studies looked at what are the impacts of agriculture and how do you actually start achieving climate goals, but also public health goals by starting to tweak elements of the food system. And so those studies really identified that dietary change was a critical component of trying to address both planetary health, so things like climate change, biodiversity loss, water supplies, but also human health in terms of just our overall well-being and trying to mitigate various chronic diseases, for example. And so that was the first time that these spheres of environmental health and climate change was brought together with public health, and the science was there to support it at this global scale. And so that was really nice for me because it shifted my sense of self-despair a little bit from learning about the role of animal agriculture to, okay, here are some ways that we can improve the food system in one very important way through dietary change that we can start to address some of the problems that I work on. So these are two instances of when science and interdisciplinary science really came together in order to change my mind and actually the trajectory of my research and my career.